You are still trying to control what you cannot contain. I say that as a diagnosis. You came here for a specific reason, and what brought you to this moment has a name, even if something inside you hesitates to say it out loud. There is an old miscalculation, deeply human, that begins long before you have words to describe it. You assumed responsibility for things that were never yours, the outcome of decisions still pending, the judgment of people who stay silent, the distance of someone you love, the weight of a tomorrow that does not yet exist, and you carry all of it right now in the rhythm of your own breathing. I never asked that of you. The cost of that misplaced burden shows up before thoughts do. It lives in the body. It appears in the tightening of your chest when the phone rings, in the tension across your shoulders at dawn, in the mind that runs through entire nights, calculating things that lead nowhere. You recognize this routine. You keep carrying the weight because you lack clarity about what you are actually holding and about whether letting go is truly possible. Let's settle this now. Let me ask you something before we go further. Is it working? All that effort to anticipate, calculate, and control, is it making you safer? Is it producing the peace you are searching for? Is it giving you the rest you know you need, even if you rarely admit that to anyone besides yourself? Answer honestly. Not for me, for you. Because in truth, the mechanism you call caution is a habit, an old pattern that convinced you it was necessary simply by being familiar. There is a real difference, a difference that changes everything, between what is necessary and what is merely familiar. The familiar simulates security because you know the weight of it. You have mastered the terrain of that specific pain. You have learned to move through it. Over time, that familiarity with suffering becomes more comfortable than the risk of the unknown, even when the unknown is called peace, even when it is called rest, even when it carries my name. The necessary is what actually sustains you. You will need to release control to experience real support. These two movements do not coexist. One drives out the other. Anxiety operates like a theology. It defines a way of believing, a way of interpreting the world, time, and your position within the larger scheme of things. Its premise is simple and devastating. The universe runs without adequate supervision, and tomorrow depends on your constant vigilance. The gaps in providence are your territory. Your exhausted attention is the mechanism holding collapse at bay. It is a lie with the structure of a truth. That is why it convinces. Every anxious thought declares, without words, that my Father is insufficient for the urgency of this moment. I say that to name the problem with precision, because healing requires brutal honesty. Anxiety thrives in the distance between what you confess with your mouth during the day and what you actually believe at 3 in the morning when the full weight is on your chest and no performance is left in you. In that silence with no audience, what do you believe about me? Philippians 4:6 gives the instruction plainly. Do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation, by prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, present your request to God. Paul wrote those words from inside a prison, with no guarantee of tomorrow, no control over the verdict, no access to what was unfolding beyond the walls. He did not offer an abstract promise from a protected life. He described a practice that survived the worst possible context. The instruction does not suggest that anxiety is wrong as a feeling. It redirects the movement anxiety naturally provokes. Instead of turning inward, running in a closed circuit, consuming itself, the energy of fear finds direction, finds a destination, finds my presence as its point of arrival. Matthew 6:27 frames the question that closes the argument. Can any one of you, by worrying, add a single hour to your life? Not 1 hour, not one decision resolved, not one relationship repaired, not one diagnosis altered. Worry does not deliver what it promises. It consumes the present while giving nothing to the future. You know my Father provides. You know I was sent to become like you, to carry flesh, weariness, the feeling of abandonment, the temptation to give up. I name that without condemnation, because the anxious response expresses your human condition. Faith acts in the redirecting of fear when it arrives. It is grounded in the certainty of a presence that is internal, close to your chest, not a peripheral force watching from a distance. Release now what you cannot carry, not tomorrow. Now, I am with you. I know which specific thought is with you right now. The one that came back this morning. The one that gets louder in silence. The one that outlasts every distraction you try, with a persistence that wears you down more than the thought's actual content ever could. You tried replacing it. You tried staying busy, scrolling, shifting into conversation. It stayed. I know that thought by name. You do not need to say it out loud for me to hear it. It may be about money. The account balance you checked first thing this morning, before even getting up, as if the numbers could have changed overnight. The uncertainty about making it through next month or next year, or what happens if the worst scenario you rehearse in your mind becomes real. It may be about health, a symptom that persists, one you searched at 11 at night with a mixture of need and dread. The silence of someone you love that hides more than it reveals, and the feeling that you should be able to protect them and cannot. It may be the exhaustion inside a relationship you no longer know how to name. The weight of conversations that keep getting delayed because the right moment never arrives, or because you are no longer certain a right moment exists. The distance that grew so gradually you only notice it now. Two people living under the same roof, the silence between them heavier than anything ever spoken. It may be the path of a child, the pain of watching hard choices without being able to step in, the exact awareness of where your love reaches its limit, a love that is enormous and still not enough to redirect another life. It may be a dream that faded, the confrontation with past choices that raises a cruel question about your current worth, the sense that time moved in a way you never authorized, and what remains does not match what you once imagined. I know. I will not offer the easy answers so many voices rush to give, refusing the management language, the numbered steps, the worn phrases about resilience. That refusal is necessary because those constructions fail at the task they promise to do. They do not dissolve the weight. They cover it with a thin layer of positive vocabulary that collapses on the first hard night. What you feel is real. The scenarios you fear do happen. Jobs end. Marriages break. Diagnoses arrive and reshape entire lives with a force no memorized verse anticipates honestly enough. Grief moves in. The body fails. People you loved pull away or leave. The world holds concrete dangers, and pretending otherwise would be cruelty dressed as faith. I came to say something harder and truer than any promise of automatic protection. Even if it happens, I will be there. The worst scenario you are trying to prevent has already been considered by my Father, before you were born. He operates beyond your capacity to anticipate, beyond the horizon you reach when you project your worst possible outcomes. Providence is not the absence of difficulty. Providence is the presence that inhabits the interior of your journey, sharing the silence, moving through the darkness, holding the weight when it reaches the extreme. That is why I took on flesh, not to watch from a safe and comfortable distance, to frequent the exhaustion of the wells, the houses in mourning, the unstable boats in storms threatening to split the hull. I lived the abandonment of friends in the gravest moment. I carried the feeling that heaven had closed and the Father's silence pressed like accusation. No circumstance you face is new to me, not one. Isaiah 43:2 does not promise the absence of fire or water. It promises companionship inside them. When you pass through the waters, I will be with you. When you walk through the fire, you will not be burned. The preposition matters. Inside, together, walking through with you, not waiting on the other side with a report on what you should have done differently. Psalm 139 goes further. It declares there is no place you can go where my presence does not arrive first. The wings of the morning, the depths of the sea, the darkness that feels solid around you, all of it has already been inhabited by me before you arrived. You never enter any territory of suffering for the first time. I have already been there. My presence already knows that address. In truth, anxiety signals a crisis of presence, not a failure of memory. The problem is not that you forgot the promises, you know them. You recite certain verses with fluency. The problem is that theoretical knowledge stays peripheral when the weight is internal. Knowing the text and still lying awake at 3 in the morning with your chest tight reveals that information arrived before experience. Genuine faith matures in a living relationship, away from performance, in real contact with the person behind the words, not just the words themselves. Healing requires that encounter, with the one who was described, with the one who has walked what you are walking, with the one who is here right now, in this moment, while you watch this and try to decide whether you can trust what you are hearing. You share this feeling with others who came before you. I say that without the emptiness of rehearsed phrases designed to fill long silences. Understanding that your burden has been carried before, by real people, produces a specific kind of relief. The relief of someone who discovers that the territory that felt unprecedented has already been crossed, mapped by the experience of others, and survived. These stories remained in the pages of Scripture for millennia precisely because they express human reality with enough honesty to be recognized by every generation that follows. The loneliness of fear amplifies its weight. Isolation feeds the illusion that no one understands, that your case is singular, that this particular darkness has no precedent in the entire history of humanity. That perception is wrong, and correcting it changes something real in the way you carry what you carry. Consider Abraham. He received a promise from my father and left. The biblical text moves forward with a directness that is almost disturbing in its simplicity. He went out, not knowing where he was going. A man left his land, his family, the safety net of everything he had ever known, with no map of arrival, no guaranteed timeline, no visual confirmation of the destination. Only the word of a God he had encountered and chosen to follow. Abraham faced real doubt, the kind of doubt that moves a person to action, to the attempt to resolve by his own hands what belonged to the pace of divine planning. He tried to accelerate the fulfillment of the promise through his own effort. He failed. He generated pain that lasted generations. In truth, my father stayed with him anyway. He held the choice. He refused to search for someone with a flawless faith and an unblemished record. He continued with Abraham and fulfilled the promise through the mistake, the delay, and every piece of contrary evidence the horizon produced. Consider Moses. 40 years in the desert before the call came. Standing before the burning bush, in an experience without parallel in human history, his first response was a list of objections. Who am I to go? What if they don't believe me? I have never been a man of eloquence. The man chosen to liberate an entire nation spent his first direct encounter with God, trying to convince God of his own error in the selection. He did it repeatedly, convinced he was doing God a favor by declining the assignment. My father held the choice. He went forward with Moses, weaving his capacities and his limitations into a work that no human skill alone could have completed. Consider David. Psalm 22 opens with a line that should stop anyone who knows the description of its author. My God, why have you forsaken me? Those words came from the mouth of the man after God's own heart. Not a rebel, not someone in deliberate withdrawal, someone who loved my father with a depth the father himself acknowledged, and who still experienced desolation as something concrete, devastating, and present. David recorded that feeling without softening it. My father preserved that psalm in Scripture, receiving it as a legitimate part of the narrative of life with him. The honest cry of the soul in the desert is different from the rejection of someone walking away, and my father discerns that difference with a precision no human judgment can reach. Consider Job. He lost children, possessions, and health in a succession that left no space for grief between one loss and the next. The comfort expected from his friends converted into systematic accusation. Facing that, he maintained his dialogue with my father through honest confrontation. Why did this happen to me? Where are you? Answer me. Raw questions, stripped of religious polish, launched from inside a bottomless pain. My father answered with his presence and with the revelation of who he is, expanding Job's horizon beyond the immediate suffering until the original question lost the urgency it once carried. The presence surpassed the real pain of loss. It did not erase it. It surpassed it. Consider Elijah. He called down fire from heaven and confronted 450 prophets in an act of total exposure, sustained only by the conviction that my Father would respond, and my Father responded. In the very next chapter, that same man was under a tree in the desert, asking to die. "It is enough, Lord, take my life." Exhaustion and fear reached the man who had just witnessed the miracle. The victory did not immunize him against collapse. Facing his depletion, my Father sent an angel to touch him physically and offer what was necessary. "Get up and eat, for the journey is too great for you." Food, rest, and presence preceded any instruction about the next step. My Father tended to the body before he spoke to the mission. Each of them knew the weight of uncertainty, promises that delayed beyond what felt bearable, circumstances that actively contradicted the word that had been given, silence that seemed like abandonment and concealed a presence larger than the silence could contain. My Father inhabited every one of those moments without exception. The pattern holds consistently across the entire arc of history. He shows up inside the weight, at the exact center of the darkness where you find yourself right now. You are not in new territory. You are in a very old story, and that story has a pattern of resolution you need to know. Understand now the lesson of the desert as a historical event with precise instruction for your current reality. Hundreds of thousands of people left the structure and predictability of Egypt. There was pain in slavery, real pain, the kind that marked the body and compressed life. But it was a familiar pain, predictable, with known schedules and a logic that, however cruel, followed a recognizable pattern. Ahead of them stretched the desert. No maps, no defined timeline, no visible resources. Entire families marching toward an uncertain horizon, fielding the questions of children and the doubts of the elderly and the accumulated weight of everyone carrying everything they own on their backs. My Father sustained them. That provision came daily for 40 years, independent of the collective spiritual performance or the population's current levels of gratitude. There was no bonus for exemplary faith and no supply cut for repeated ingratitude. Each morning brought the ground covered in something unprecedented, something that challenged the vocabulary brought from Egypt and the known methods of cultivation and harvest. They called it manna, a word that translates a question rather than an answer. What is this? The question persisted. The food remained, in the exact measure for the day. Every attempt to stockpile for the following day failed in a systematic and instructive way. The human instinct is to accumulate resources, money, health, security, approval, to establish a comfortable distance from scarcity. In truth, the stored manna rotted and bred worms. That deterioration was intentional. It was not a system failure. It was the system teaching its primary lesson before the entry into the promised land. A free nation requires a mindset liberated from fear of tomorrow. Compulsive accumulation is, at its root, a declaration of distrust, and my Father chose to address that distrust before any other teaching. The instruction I left in the Lord's Prayer reflects this reality precisely. Give us this day our daily bread. Grace meets the current day. The manna available this morning covers the needs of this morning. Tomorrow's manna does not yet exist in the present, not because my Father is stingy with future provision, but because you were designed for daily trust, and daily trust cannot be practiced when 3 months of supply are already in view. Anxiety reflects the attempt to stockpile manna. It is the effort to take today's real provision and use it to secure tomorrow, loading the present with a double weight. The weight of today added to the weight of a day that has not arrived yet, and that may arrive with a configuration entirely different from what you anticipated. That excess spoils in your hands because it works against the design of the day, not because you are weak, because the system was never built to function that way. The sleepless nights of mental calculations reveal this attempt to live tomorrow on today's limited resources. You take the grace available for this hour and force it to cover every future hour you can imagine. The stretching inevitably tears, and the tearing convinces you that the provision is insufficient, when the truth is that the provision was applied to the wrong target. My Father calibrated grace for the current day, with precision. Tomorrow's supply will arrive with tomorrow, in the exact measure of that specific day's need, its specific circumstances, its specific demands, its specific weight. You do not need to carry tomorrow's weight today, because tomorrow's grace has not yet been distributed. It will come. It came for Abraham, for Moses, for David, for Job, for Elijah, for everyone who crossed the desert before you. You were designed for daily trust. In this exact moment, under the weight you carry right now, the manna covers the ground around your feet. The provision is certain. What remains is the decision to bend down and receive it. I speak directly to your interior now. I bypass the public version that manages routines, answers messages, and performs wellness to avoid questions. I address what remains when the daily performance stops, when the door closes, when the screen goes dark, when there is no one left for whom you need to present the functional version of yourself. What remains in that silence is reality. And that reality is what I know by name. A name spoken by the Father in your formation, prior to any social role you have assumed, prior to any identity constructed by the expectations of others or the achievements you claim as your own. That original name is what I call when I speak to you. Receive this as someone being genuinely found, not evaluated, not instructed, not corrected. Found. The argument that your problem is real stands. The word I left in the world refuses anesthesia. It refuses to minimize the severity of what is actually happening, to reduce what hurts, to dissolve concrete suffering into uplifting abstractions. In truth, anesthesia only postpones suffering and conceals the dysfunctional belief operating beneath it. The belief that you must control the uncontrollable, filling gaps that belong to providence, carrying responsibilities that were never yours. What stays hidden resists transformation. Covered pain does not heal. It migrates. The solid foundation operates differently. Under it, the storm retains its force. The wind and rain retain their impact. The circumstances remain real and heavy and sometimes brutal. The structure holds not because the weather changes, but because the foundation exceeds the power of the external situation. That is the difference between managing suffering and being sustained through it. In the original Greek, the word for mental distraction in Matthew 6:25 is merimnao, to split the mind. Anxiety divides your existence between the present and the future threat, preventing you from fully inhabiting either. You are not entirely here because part of you is already in the worst scenario you can project, and you are not truly there because that future reality has not yet arrived with its concrete circumstances. You inhabit a space between two times, belonging to neither, exhausted by the effort of existing in two places at once. Assess now the record of energy you spent on tragic scenarios that never materialized. That mental and emotional effort consumed the present without altering any real outcome. Anticipation charges the price of the worst scenario repeatedly with compound interest while offering no actual protection guarantee in return. You paid the emotional cost of dozens of catastrophes that never happened. That payment was not investment. It produced no return. It consumed the present and delivered absence in exchange. Tomorrow will bring its own demands. That is certain. My Father designed the human frame for daily limits, and that design is not a constraint to be overcome. It is the structure that protects you from a collapse no human strength can sustain. Bringing future weight into the present overloads that frame beyond its actual capacity. Tomorrow will present its own unfamiliar challenges, yes, but it will carry resources and graces proportional to them. Resources unavailable today because they are not yet needed today. The fear you carry right now rests on an imaginary construction built with the scarce tools of the present. You use what you have now to calculate what comes next, and the calculation fails because tomorrow's data does not yet exist. The future reality will differ from what you project. It always does. The problem rarely arrives in the exact form fear chose for it. And when it does arrive, the grace that accompanies it is no longer today's grace. It is grace calibrated for that specific day, with a precision your anticipation cannot replicate. Release the projection. Inhabit this moment. I am here, in this moment, and not in the scenario you fear. The persistence of a problem after prayer is a legitimate tension. I name that with precision because the silence around it creates unnecessary isolation. You prayed. You may have prayed repeatedly, with the right words, with a sincere posture, with whatever conviction you could gather. The problem stayed. And that persistence raised a question you may not have said out loud, but that lives beneath everything. What is wrong with me? Nothing. That condition signals the honesty of someone who keeps pressing for an answer, not a failure of conviction. Paul asked for the removal of his thorn 3 times. 3 times, not from lack of faith, not from absence of history with my Father, not from ignorance of what could be asked. Paul understood the power available better than most. He worked miracles. He wrote half of what you read when you opened the New Testament. And still he asked 3 times for the same thing and received all 3 times the same answer. My grace is sufficient for you. The sufficiency of grace means the resource available in the crisis exceeds the capacity for loss that the circumstance imposes. In truth, divine logic inverts the human expectation that great problems demand the immediate removal of suffering. Power manifests at the real limit of human capacity, at the exact point where you can no longer sustain the weight alone, and the fact that you are still standing begins to reveal a support that is not yours. Paul's thorn was not removed because its presence demonstrated something that its removal would have hidden. There is a precise distinction between possessing strength and being sustained. Inner strength is finite and depends on favorable conditions. It works when you have slept, when the situation is under relative control, when resources are sufficient. Sustaining comes from an external source immune to depletion, one that does not diminish under demand, does not tire with duration, does not fail under the magnitude of what it faces. Acknowledged weakness exposes supernatural action. The thorn becomes, then, the most compelling evidence of grace's effectiveness. The attempt to stop anxious thoughts by force or distraction fails because they return. You know that cycle. Suppression works for hours, sometimes days, and the thought comes back carrying the accumulated force of the time it spent compressed. Psalm 62:8 offers a different direction. Pour out your heart before God. That act requires the complete and immediate emptying of the vessel, without edits, without filters to select what seems spiritually presentable, without the sorting that separates what can be said from what embarrasses. Bring the chaos, the bitterness you hide because you do not know how to explain it without appearing ungrateful or weak or unstable. The irrational fear you know is irrational, and that persists anyway. The uncomfortable doubt about whether my Father truly hears, truly acts, truly cares about the specifics of your situation. The exhaustion that has no exact vocabulary because it runs deeper than physical tiredness and is more diffuse than any diagnosis you have tried to apply to it. The refuge receives that raw reality. It waives the screening of shame. The accelerated mind finds immediate reception, even before reaching silence, even before you can formulate the request with the clarity you think you should have. When you bring the internal noise into prayer, the noise persists for a time. But it loses the character of isolation, because now it exists inside a presence that surpasses it, and the loneliness that was amplifying the weight dissolves on contact with the one who already knew the contents before you found the words for them. You do not need to arrive clean. Arrive. The question about practical application is legitimate. How does this actually work? There is a visible gap between mastering the technical vocabulary of faith and the ability to convert instruction into lived experience. You know what you should do. You know the verses. You understand the theological structure, and still the weight remains, and the distance between what you know and what you can actually live defines the exact point where transformation needs to occur. In Philippians 4:6-7, Paul establishes a logical sequence with deliberate precision. Each step grounds the next. Omitting any element alters the final result, not partially, but structurally, the way removing a load-bearing beam and expecting the ceiling to hold. The first step is prayer. Not the physical posture, not the correct vocabulary, not a minimum duration for the exercise to count. Prayer is the orientation of the self toward a higher presence, interrupting the effort to resolve, argue, or calculate. It begins the moment you decide to stop the isolation. That movement acknowledges the limits of self-sufficiency, and that acknowledgement is, in itself, an act of courage most people underestimate. The second step requires petition. Paul prescribes the concrete and specific request, refusing generic phrases that avoid naming reality because naming it feels risky or ungrateful or excessive. Ask for what weighs on you, by its actual name. Specificity gives an address to what was previously a diffuse weight, making the burden deliverable to real hands. The precise verbalization of fear and need allows the load to become clear enough for deposit into hands that hold it without effort. My Father already knows what you carry. The human declaration formalizes the release. It moves the weight from your frame to providence with a gesture of clear intention. The third step introduces thanksgiving simultaneously with the request, not after the answer. That sequence detail changes everything. Anticipated gratitude is not performative optimism, not a pretense that the difficulty does not exist. It expresses recognition of the track record of faithfulness of the one who hears, independent of the outcome of the current request. You do not give thanks because the problem is resolved. You give thanks because you know who received the request, and that knowledge converts demand into trust and desperation into informed expectation. Executing that sequence produces the peace of God. The promise focuses on internal protection, leaving the reality of circumstances and human timelines unchanged. Paul does not promise that the bills will be paid, that the relationship will be restored, that the diagnosis will change. He promises internal protection while those realities remain open. The Greek term phroresai describes the act of military garrisoning, positioning divine peace as a shield between the external threat and the integrity of your being. That peace does not depend on your spiritual performance. It operates beyond the limits of any situation you face. This sequence is not a technique. It is a relationship with structure. The structure serves the encounter, and the encounter produces what no technique can replicate. The association between releasing and passivity is incorrect. I need to name that with precision before continuing, because this specific confusion prevents more people from experiencing genuine freedom than almost any other theological distortion. Releasing is not giving up. Trusting is not neglecting. The surrender I described differs from paralyzing resignation with the same clarity that surgery differs from abandoning a patient. The Greek expression epiripsantes in 1 Peter 5:7 describes the intentional act of casting and deliberately transferring the weight to capable hands, with the exact force and intention of someone hurling something heavy, preventing the burden from returning to their own shoulders. It is a highly executive action. It requires decision, direction, and the muscular effort of someone carrying something real who chooses, with clear determination, to put it down somewhere else. Passivity does not cast anything. It only sinks under the weight. Daily effectiveness depends on a clear separation between human and divine responsibilities, a distinction that, when practiced consistently, reorganizes the entire structure of your daily journey. Your responsibility covers the decisions available today, the steps you can take with the resources you have right now, the conversations that depend on your initiative, the choices that fall within the reach of this day's control. That sphere demands full engagement, presence, discernment, courage when necessary, humility when necessary. There is no concession here. You act with everything you have within the space that is genuinely yours. My Father's responsibility encompasses the final outcome, the reactions of others that you cannot control, no matter how hard you try, the hidden variables operating beyond your field of vision, the scenarios of tomorrow that do not yet exist and that will arrive with a configuration your anticipation cannot faithfully replicate. That territory belongs to providence, not through abandonment on your part, but by the design of the one who created a system in which each sphere functions with excellence when it respects its own boundary. Anxiety arises precisely in the attempt to accumulate both functions simultaneously. You execute your part, and you are right to execute it, and then you cross the boundary and try to also control the outcome, the reactions of others, the invisible variables, all of tomorrow. That overlap produces no additional security. It produces exhaustion because you were designed for one sphere and are operating in two. Worry carries no predictive power. It alters no fact. In truth, faith exercises the separation of these spheres in daily practice, not as an abstract concept, but as a concrete habit that rebuilds itself with each decision, each morning, each moment. The mind crosses the boundary and you bring it back to its own territory. Peter knew that crossing at a visceral level. He stepped out of the boat. He walked on water, and that is real, and it happened, and no naturalistic explanation accounts for it. While his gaze remained on me, the weight of his body did not do what physics prescribed. The moment he began to sink was not the moment he doubted me. It was the moment he began to try to recalculate the wind and assume personal responsibility for the outcome of the path. He transferred his gaze from the sustainer to the variables, and variables sustain no one. The rescue came immediately after his strength ran out, not after a reasonable learning period, not after a sufficiently humbling verbal correction. The hand arrived at the instant of sinking, and the question that followed identified the error with surgical precision. Peter had assigned to himself the sustaining of the journey. The responsibility for the physics of the miracle entered his sphere, and the human sphere cannot hold that. You are responsible for the step in front of you. The outcome belongs to my Father. That is not a division of responsibility that diminishes your agency. It is a division that protects it, that preserves your capacity to act in the present without the collapse that comes from trying to govern what is beyond any human governance. The boundary does not limit you. It frees you to operate with genuine excellence within the space that is truly yours, without the weight of what was never yours to carry. Cast the weight, with force and intention, and do not let it return. Genuine rest manifests inside the crisis, not after its resolution. That distinction needs to be stated clearly because the distorted version of rest, the kind that will only arrive when the problem is solved, when the situation stabilizes, when you finally have enough control over the variables, that version never comes. You postpone it indefinitely because there is always the next problem, the next uncertainty, the next reason to wait just a little longer before resting for real. Matthew 11:28-30 does not promise the elimination of responsibilities or the artificial simplification of life. It promises rest within it. There are two natures of weight, distinguishable by their origin. The weight I carry alongside you is real and has substance. The difficulty in the relationship, the financial pressure, the uncertainty about health, the grief you are still processing. That weight exists, and I do not minimize it. The harmful weight is the additional load you place on top of the real one. The attempt to maintain control over elements that belong to others, the guarantee of outcomes that belong to my Father, the management of the reactions of people who carry their own freedom that you cannot and should not govern. That second weight is not inevitable. It is learned, born in environments of early imposed demands, informative traumas, in a culture that equates anxiety with responsibility and turns constant suffering into proof of serious commitment. That pattern can be unlearned. It is not your nature. It is an adaptation that served a purpose in a specific context and that now costs more than it delivers. The yoke I offer in Matthew 11 is not decorative metaphor. It was a concrete instrument in the agrarian context of Galilee, and the image carries technical precision. The yoke distributes the load between two, aligns the pace, makes possible a journey that neither could complete alone with the same efficiency. In truth, my yoke calibrates the real weight of your existence for mutual cooperation, not for its elimination, but for its redistribution in a partnership where the stronger side pulls the greater portion of the load and you walk aligned without being crushed by it. The current overload results from the accumulation of functions that exceed the human design. The guarantee of outcomes, the control of tomorrow, the dependence on others' approval to confirm your own worth. Each of these functions, added to the legitimate weight of the day, produces a structure overloaded beyond its capacity to hold. And the collapse you feel, physically or emotionally, is not weakness. It is the correct response of a structure operating above the load for which it was designed. The gentleness I describe in Matthew 11:29 is not timidity or passive submission. It expresses the absence of the need for constant self-assertion, the absence of the effort to continuously prove that you are worthy, that you are enough, that your place is legitimate. That need to prove generates a specific category of anxiety, anxiety directed at reputation, at managing the narrative others construct about you, at controlling how you are perceived. My Father's sufficiency renders all those external validations unnecessary. An identity anchored in the divine verdict frees you from the obligation to prove your worth through suffering, constant production, or the performance of a faith that appears more solid than it actually is. The promised rest reaches the soul, the deep core that anxiety strikes before conscious thought, before words, before the rational formulation of any concern. That is the layer where the tightness in your chest exists before you know why, where the weight wakes up with you before any memory of what weighs. That is precisely the layer the rest I offer reaches, not the surface of managed thoughts, but the interior of the being that precedes all of them. That condition is found when you stop searching in the wrong directions and turn toward the right source. Rest remains available now, in this moment, inside the circumstance that has not changed. Its effectiveness depends on the orientation of your movement. Come, not later. Now. Presence operates as the most practical and transformative experience available. I say that with deliberate precision because the word practical carries weight here. More practical than any technique, more transformative than any sequence of steps designed to produce peace. The relationship I offer refuses the one-sidedness of a speech directed at silence. In truth, it is dialogue and mutual presence, an intimacy that transforms the being through simple exposure to who I am, without requiring you to reach a specific state before contact is valid. Most traditional teaching on spirituality points in the wrong direction. Conventional learning encourages the search for presence in special moments, services of intense emotional charge, retreats removed from daily routine, prayers marked by sensations that confirm contact. Those moments carry real weight. I do not deny them. The dependence on them, however, makes faith unsustainable in daily life because real life unfolds on Tuesday mornings, in the middle of hostile traffic, with messages accumulating before 8 o'clock, with a tiredness that sleep did not resolve and a mind that accelerated before you even remembered why. If my presence depended on controlled conditions, it would be absent precisely in urgency, and urgency is exactly when you need it. Psalm 145:18 declares that the Lord is near to all who call on Him in truth. The Hebrew term karof defines the physical proximity of individuals in the same space. It eliminates the idea of a spiritual distance to be overcome through accumulated devotional effort, consistent performance, or any achievement you need to reach before you deserve the approach. The requirement for that proximity dispenses with perfection and specific emotional states. The condition rests in truth, in the honesty of presenting yourself without performance, without the filter that separates what can be shown from what embarrasses. Amy Carmichael understood presence by inhabiting limiting circumstances, not by ignoring them. The sick room where she spent decades became the location of the most tangible manifestation of divine reality she ever knew. The elimination of alternatives revealed the support that had always been available, not as compensation for limitation, but as the revelation of what existed before it and would remain after. That awareness is accessible now, in this moment, without waiting for ideal environments that rarely arrive in the form you imagine. The execution of this practice is simple, though it requires constant intentionality. It consists in the act of redirecting attention, interrupting the automatic flow of thoughts to acknowledge the presence that already occupies the same space as you. It requires no elaborate speech, no rigid structure of a prayer with a formatted beginning, middle, and end. In truth, the mention of my name operates as an acknowledgement of presence. It formalizes the refusal to experience the moment in isolation, without requiring the moment to change its configuration for the contact to be valid. Brother Lawrence validated that accessibility in the kitchen of a monastery, carrying out ordinary tasks with no visible spiritual glamour. Pots, fire, repetitive work, the smell of food, the noise of institutional daily life. He identified that the separation between the sacred and the secular lacks practical foundation, that my availability remains identical in the chapel and in ordinary work, in the silence of prayer and in the noise of the kitchen, in the sensation of elevation and in the complete absence of any recognizable spiritual feeling. The constancy resides in my nature, not in your capacity for perception. The genuine initial practice of that redirection transforms the individual while temporarily leaving the external situation unchanged. The circumstances remain. The anxiety and the thoughts retain their impact. What changes first is the isolation. The weight stops being carried alone and begins to exist inside a presence that surrounds it without being consumed by it. That is the first movement, and it is enough to begin. The promise of never leaving or forsaking, recorded in Hebrews 13:5, admits no exceptions of circumstance, performance, or quality of present faith. The separation you currently experience comes strictly from misdirected attention, not from my distance. I did not withdraw. You shifted focus to the weight, to the situation, to the projection. The return is simple. Redirect your attention. I am here, where I have always been, one decision of acknowledgement away. Beneath anxiety lives a question that is rarely spoken aloud. Beneath every projection into the dark, every night calculation, every misplaced burden you carry past your legitimate territory, there is a deep question operating in the subsoil of everything. Who remains when the personal constructions disappear? When the job is gone, when the relationship breaks, when health fails, when the narrative you built about yourself loses the pillars that held it up, what stays? That question is not abstract. In truth, anxiety tries to answer it through control. It holds external structures together through constant effort because it fears that without them, there is nothing underneath. The fear of losing the job, the relationship, the health. That fear is not only about the job, the relationship, or the health. It is about identity. It is about the terror of the void that may be waiting when the constructions fall. Anxiety expresses, at its root, an identity crisis. The social environment defines the individual by what they produce, what they accumulate, what they display. That environment carries a scarce vocabulary for the being that precedes achievement, for who you are before what you do, before what you accomplish, before what others decide you are worth. A self-image built in the mirror of performance results in structural instability because that reflection shifts with the day, with the observer, with circumstances no one controls, with the consistency the system demands. Seeking stability on a variable foundation produces the current exhaustion. The tiredness comes from the obligation to guard the image and sustain the public narrative without interruption, without rest, without a single moment in which you can simply exist without proving. The declaration of 1 John 3:1 invites you to consider the love of the Father that grants the title of children of God. That condition differs precisely from the position of employees, whose standing depends on the quality of work delivered. It differs from the position of guests, tolerated under good behavior and subject to removal if the rules are violated. Sonship establishes permanence and unconditional belonging, an identity received prior to any achievement, immune to circumstantial losses. Human logic demands that belonging be earned through merit, because earlier experiences taught that affection has conditions. Divine logic operates in a radically different way. My Father's knowledge and choice of you precede any achievement or demonstration of worthiness on your part. The calling of your name, the original name, spoken before any social role, sustains your existence through love, without the conditional grammar of the demands you have internalized. The angelic greeting to Mary, affirming that the Lord was with her, described a pre-existing reality independent of future actions. She had not yet accomplished anything when the divine presence was confirmed over her. Presence operates in the present tense, before the resolution of doubts, before reaching ideal levels of performance, before you become the version of yourself you think would deserve the care you already receive. That realization alters the dynamic of anxiety at the structural level. Anchoring identity in production turns any material threat into an existential risk and legitimizes fear in a way that paralyzes, because existential fear does not respond to the same tools that circumstantial fear does. In truth, anchoring identity in my Father's verdict preserves the center of the being even when the periphery faces severe pressure. Circumstantial crises retain their gravity and demand serious attention. I do not minimize them, but they lose the capacity to affect the core of existence. That distinction provides solid ground for your feet on terrain that keeps shifting. Paul wrote in real confinement, under chains and uncertainty about his own tomorrow, declaring the learned contentment in any state. That learning was consolidated through shipwrecks, beatings, and betrayals, not through favorable circumstances that made contentment easy. He identified the existence of an internal foundation, established by my Father and immune to external pressures, that remained intact while everything around it varied. The declaration that all things are possible through the one who strengthens describes access to an independent supply, guaranteed by belonging, not by performance. When the thought of personal or material insufficiency for future challenges arrives, interrupt the flow. Examine the origin of that demand. Discern the difference between the voice that evaluates the individual by production and the voice that knew you at the origin, before production, before performance, before any result that could justify the care. Evaluation based on technical performance ignores essential data that my Father holds with full integrity. Sonship is unalterable by outcomes, circumstances, or self-judgment. My Father secures care for his children, not as a reward for what they delivered, but as an expression of who he is. Your experience of time determines the cost of your current suffering. Most of the overload you carry does not come from the present. It comes from past events or future projections, two territories that exist in thought with a vividness that confuses the mind about where it actually is. The present is the exclusive space of real life, of divine presence, and of active grace. And it remains chronically uninhabited because the mind abandons it for the extremes of time with a frequency that habit has made invisible. The human capacity to travel mentally across time is real and carries legitimate function. Learning from error requires returning to the past. Planning for tomorrow requires venturing into the future. Neither is the problem. The absence of control over that faculty generates the damage when the return to the past does not serve learning, but the repeated review of unchangeable decisions that reactivate old pain without producing any alteration in the facts. When the venture into the future does not serve planning, but the anticipation of harm, projecting tragic scenarios in detail that advance suffering in a way that is entirely unnecessary. The result is the absence from now, and now is the only place where I can be found, where grace is available, where life actually happens. Psalm 118:24 validates the current day as intentional creation by my Father, furnished with resources and graces specific to the exact demands of this day. This day is not an accident. It is not a corridor of passage toward a more meaningful tomorrow. It is not an obstacle between you and the moment when life will finally begin the right way. It is a planned work with provision calibrated for what it contains. The invitation requires inhabiting that present reality with attention and awareness, abandoning the posture of mere survival or waiting transition. The past with active consequences requires honest processing, adequate grief, and gradual release. That is necessary and legitimate. Distinct from that is the punishing past, rehearsed not for processing, but for the reactivation of shame, for the repeated judgment of a defendant who has already been judged and whom the internal tribunal refuses to release. The directive of Philippians 3:13 describes the deliberate forward orientation of the self, not the denial of facts, not the suppression of what happened, but the conscious choice of the direction of movement. What is behind remains unchangeable, The future admits authorship. My Father operates in the redemption of broken structures with a competence that does not depend on the perfection of the material he receives. My Father's thoughts, as declared in Jeremiah 29:11, define peace and wholeness for your trajectory, surpassing the severe self-assessments marked by shame and the forecasts constructed by anxiety. The Hebrew term shalom expresses the presence of every element necessary for the full flourishing of the being: wholeness, the absence of fragmentation, nothing missing in its right place. That plan is active in the present, even under contrary circumstances, even before distances that seem insurmountable between where you are and where that plan promises you will arrive. The context of that declaration matters. Jeremiah 29:11 was spoken to people in exile, deported to Babylon, with 70 years projected before restoration. The divine instruction for that waiting season refused passivity. The command specified building houses, planting gardens, forming families, seeking the welfare of the foreign city. Inhabiting the present is not resigning yourself to exile as a final destination. It is living actively in the current coordinate, with faithfulness to what this day requires, knowing that my Father manages the future while you answer for the now. The encounter with my presence occurs strictly in the present, because the limits of physical and biological existence locate you here. The body occupies the now. Breathing happens in the now. Facing each mental drift into the past or the future, return to the present moment persistently and without self-condemnation for the drift. The now concentrates the reality of your being and the assistance I offer. The present is enough, not because it is easy, because I am here. I take a different approach now. I refuse the impulse to supply quick answers and ready-made spiritual formulations. Allow each question to reach the core of your current experience, the place where the factual truth of your condition resides, not the edited version you present to the world. Transformation occurs at that depth, not at the surface of correct answers. What specific factor is generating your anxiety right now? Identify the particular thought that is present now, the one that woke up with you this morning and that the daily noise attempted to conceal without success. Name that reality to yourself, without the filter of social presentation. Does that fear center on the outcome of the event, or on the meaning that result will carry for your identity and for my Father's faithfulness? There is a real distinction between the fear of the fact and the fear of the existential impact of that fact. Which of those two aspects predominates in your interior right now, when the performance stops? If the worst projected scenario materialized at this moment, what element would be extracted from you? Set aside the material or relational losses for a moment. What fragment of your self-image depends on that crisis not occurring? What would you lose of yourself if the worst arrived? Does the structure currently at risk constitute your essence, or does it represent a construction built to prove your worth? In truth, real identity precedes human constructions and remains unchanged before my Father. External constructions admit dismantling. Essence rejects loss. Which of those spheres is receiving your protection right now? My Father's knowledge encompasses your full being, including the omissions, the unresolved conflicts, the serious doubts, and the fear you hide from the public. That complete mapping, without gaps, justified my sending for your benefit. I did not come for those who present flawless faith. I came for those who carry the real weight. What scenario do you project in the absence of superior oversight? Refer to the belief that operates in the middle of the night, stripped of rehearsed language, what your mind anticipates when the spiritual veneer rests. If you cease the vigilance and the guaranteeing of outcomes, what result does your mind anticipate with the greatest conviction? Beneath the architecture of fear, what actual conviction governs your view of my Father's nature? Daily conduct, decisions, and morning awakenings reveal the practical belief that governs your actions, frequently overriding what you merely confess with words. What does your behavior confess about what you actually believe? Anxiety protects something specific. It simulates action by keeping the mind occupied with worry, pushing away the sensation of passivity. In truth, It also functions to preserve the pursuit of external approval or to sustain the conviction that rest constitutes irresponsibility before the problem is resolved. Identify the exact target of the safeguard your anxiety promotes. If you relinquish the obligation to control the crisis and guarantee outcomes through worry, what identity would remain? Define who you would be without the accumulation of misplaced burdens, without the constant effort to exceed human limits, without the function of manager of a tomorrow you never volunteered to govern. Does the absolute certainty of my companionship in every tomorrow and in every scenario you project alter your next step? Taking that step requires no prior certainty. Movement grounded in trust precedes the feeling of conviction. The action comes first, and certainty consolidates along the way. What necessary action has the current fear kept postponed? The precision of the answers matters less than the willingness for honest self-examination. The provisional withdrawal allowed the reality hidden beneath the performance to surface. That act, in itself, expresses a decision of faith. Your staying until this point is an act of choice. The effort to hold your attention here, facing the weariness of belief and the pull toward distractions easier than this examination, validates the search for solid ground. You arrived here because something inside you recognizes that you need what is being said, even as the resistant mind tries to convince you otherwise. Pause the reflections for a simple physical act. Take one conscious breath, deep and deliberate. The oxygen received expresses continuous provision, independent of personal management, independent of prior planning, operating without your supervision while you slept, while you worried, while you tried to control what you cannot contain. That vital support exists apart from your control and has not failed a single time. Do it again. The immediate reality of this moment centers on our simultaneous presence, surpassing the urgency of external problems and the scatter of thoughts attempting to reclaim the space. That presence meets the demands of the present moment, the only temporal coordinate genuinely within human possession. The end of this content will reactivate the pressure of daily burdens. That return confirms the human condition and the gradual nature of transformation, which requires daily returns, not a single permanent achievement, but a practice of constant coming back. Growth is a process, grounded in the persistent refusal to give fear the final word. The regularity of small daily adjustments directs conduct with a precision no single isolated decision can reach. John 16:33 provides a realistic diagnosis of history without resorting to easy optimism. In this world, you will have trouble. The command to take heart does not deny that reality. It is grounded in the victory already secured over the system governed by fear. The outcome of your trajectory escapes the control of crises because the field of action has been redefined. Extreme suffering has lost its power of final retention. The anchor of the promise holds fixed, independent of the fluctuations of human perception. Overcoming exhaustion requires the daily choice to set down the burden, evaluating the legitimacy of each load on the mornings that follow, discerning what is genuinely yours from what you assumed without being called to carry it. The discipline consists in retaining only the responsibility for the current step and depositing the rest in the hands that hold it without effort. The only present requirement is this: fix the certainty that the sustainer of the universe manages your reality through love. That fact remains active, supporting the current conditions of your faith and your doubts with equal competence. I need to tell you something I said first in a small room, the night before everything collapsed. The disciples were gathered with me, and I knew what was coming. I knew about the abandonment that would arrive within hours. I knew that every man in that room, who had declared loyalty, who had left everything to follow, would leave me alone at the gravest moment. I spoke to them with that clarity in John 16:32. The hour is coming. Indeed, it has come, when you will be scattered, each to his own home, and will leave me alone. I declared the abandonment before it occurred, and then I added, yet I am not alone, for the Father is with me. That night, in the moment that most resembled defeat, betrayed, abandoned, about to be handed over, the presence of the Father was the only unshakable fact available. Not the loyalty of the disciples, which failed, not the circumstances, which were brutal, the presence, only the presence. Then I said to them in John 16:33, the words that need to reach the core of what you are carrying right now. In this world, you will have tribulation, not as a warning for the spiritually weak, as an honest diagnosis of reality for everyone who inhabits this world. Tribulation comes. It came for the disciples. It came for me in the most extreme form history records. It comes for you. And then the command that follows that reality: take heart, for I have overcome the world. Not the forced cheerfulness of denial, not the manufactured posture of someone pretending that difficulty does not weigh. The courage grounded in a historical and irreversible fact: the system governed by fear, by death, and by separation was overcome from the inside, not bypassed, not ignored, but walked through and surpassed. The outcome of your trajectory does not belong to the crises. The battlefield has been redefined. Now I need you to hear Matthew 6 with the ears of someone who is present, not someone reciting. I said, do not be anxious about your life, what you will eat, what you will drink, what you will wear. And I know the immediate mind reacts, but the problems are real. The bills exist. The scarcity is concrete. I continued, look at the birds of the air. They do not sow or reap or gather into barns, and your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not worth much more than they? That question is not rhetorical. It is an investigation into what you actually believe about your worth before my Father. Then the question that closes the argument about anxiety: which of you, by worrying, can add a single hour to his life, a single inch to his height? Worry does not produce what it promises. It consumes the present while delivering nothing to the future, not protection, not control, not one additional minute of existence. Consider the lilies of the field, how they grow. They do not labor or spin. Yet I tell you that not even Solomon in all his glory was dressed like one of them. If God clothes the grass of the field, which is here today and tomorrow is thrown into the furnace, will he not much more clothe you? Then the central instruction of Matthew 6:31-33. Do not be anxious, saying, what shall we eat? What shall we drink? What shall we wear? For your heavenly Father knows that you need all these things. Seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things will be added to you. Seek security first, and you will search without end. Seek resolution first, and the next problem will reset the clock. Seek the kingdom first, the reality of my Father's presence and governance over all things, and provision follows as the natural consequence of that primary orientation. Tomorrow will take care of itself. Sufficient for the day is its own trouble. That instruction was given on a hillside in Galilee to people without sophisticated safety nets, without health insurance, without retirement savings, and it remains operative for you now in 2025, with your specific bills and your specific fears and your specific uncertainties. The category of the problem has changed. The sufficiency of the Father has not. Anxiety signals the direction given to faith, not its absence. The opposite of faith is not doubt, it is indifference. Anxiety is an exercise of conviction directed at the wrong object, the operative certainty that the worst scenario will prevail over my Father's plans. The goal requires the redirection of that credible capacity toward the right target. The promised rest takes effect the moment you relinquish the management of tomorrow with today's resources. It is a gift, not an achievement, not a reward for consistent spiritual performance, not a condition available only after doubts are resolved. The sole condition rests in presenting yourself with your real burdens. Your arrival at this moment confirms the fulfillment of that requirement. The morning will attempt to restart the familiar calculations. That is certain, and it is not failure. The option available is to pause before reassuming the weight, to question the legitimacy of each burden against the manna available that day, against the grace calibrated for that specific morning. In truth, the relapses of habit require the continuous return to the presence, which remains available constantly and without conditions of access. Freedom begins when fear loses its command function over decisions and identity, moving from governor to information. Courage manifests in action grounded in faith even while fear is still present. Not the absence of fear, action in spite of it. You are part of a community of people practicing the release of misplaced burdens and learning what a living relationship looks like, far from performance. If this message found an echo in your reality, if something here touched what you were carrying before you pressed play, formalize that decision as a public declaration of trust. Write in the comments, "I trust in God." That expression declares the deliberate choice to transfer outcomes into the Father's hands, independent of remaining doubts, independent of any feeling of conviction that may or may not accompany the gesture. The declaration precedes the feeling. The movement comes first. Keep the burden in the right place tomorrow. Breathe. Gather the morning manna. Move forward under the assistance of the constant presence. The Father remains in you. I assure you of that.